Good morning and welcome, everyone. I can see people are joining the line right now, so we'll give it a few more moments to allow for more of our attendees to join, and we will be starting the session shortly. Thank you. Alrighty, again, I would love to welcome everybody and thank you for joining us at Max People and Rodney Employment Law session on Hot Seat on the Art of Terminations. My name is Christina Binder, and I am the Training and Development Coordinator here at Max People, and I'll be assisting with the production and moderation today. This session is facilitated by Jordan Rodney, founder of Rodney Employment Law and VP of HR Services, and Hen Sasson, HR Director, Center of Excellence at Max People. And we are so thrilled to be with you today to share our knowledge. Before we get started, I wanted to do a few quick housekeeping items. Today's session is intended to have a Q&A portion towards the latter half, so we encourage you to submit your questions at any time using the chat function. I will be keeping track of these questions and will moderate them at the end. Also, at the end of this session, there is a resource available for all attendees to download and a feedback QR code to scan so we can improve our future webinars. We greatly appreciate your feedback. To ensure high quality of the webinar, I ask you to ensure you have a strong internet connection, and please also close any unnecessary browsers or apps in the background. If you're experiencing quality issues during the session, please first try to exit and re-enter the live stream via the link that was sent to you upon registration. The webinar today is also being recorded and will be available for viewing afterwards. Without further ado, I will pass it over to our facilitators to begin.
Thank you, Christina. And it's wonderful to be here with my colleague, Hen Sasson. We've done lots of webinars together, and it's always very enjoyable when we do. This particular topic is, this is actually something, and I don't want to pat ourselves on the back too much, but this is something we're actually very good at as an organization, both on the HR and employment law side. I think that any company can do terminations, but the key is, how do you do them exceptionally well? And that's what we're going to talk about today. So terminations are definitely one of the most difficult, if not the most difficult challenge that employers and clients of ours face in the workplace. They're not enjoyable. Like I once had a client say to me, a sophisticated client, is it normal that I don't sleep well and don't feel well the day before termination? And I simply said to them, like, are you human? Do you have emotions? And it's like, the day you stop feeling emotional about terminations, you should probably, find another profession, because you're dealing with people's lives here. And, we want to impart to you some best practices on how to manage these seamlessly and with minimal risk for your business. So if we can go to the next slide, Hen, and of course, today we're going to focus on best practices. We're really happy. We have many clients on the line and others from the LinkedIn community. A little bit about Max People. We're an HR consulting boutique. We've been around for 20 years and we're based in Markham, Ontario. We have 4 key services, namely HR, fractional HR, recruitment, training, and employment law, offered through our sister business, Rodney Employment Law. But more than that, Hen, as you'll probably allude to as well, is if it's something that we can't do, we will find a resource who can do it for you. But thankfully, one of the things we do really well, as I said, is terminations. And I'll turn it over to you to talk through the agenda.
Yes, and just jumping in to say that I'm super excited as well to be facilitating this webinar with you, Jordan. I think we make a good team of facilitators. And this is a topic that both you and I know we have a lot of good insights on. So for today's agenda, we really are going to talk about best practices when it comes to terminations. We're going to talk about how do you manage terminations with the most empathy and professionalism? And you'll hear me say this quite often. How do you maintain the dignity and respect for that terminated individual? So we're going to talk about that. We're going to talk about strategies to minimize legal implications, legal costs. Terminations could be very costly, right? And there is a big fear in that. So we're going to talk about what you can do to potentially minimize the legal implications and cost. And we're really going to walk through the before, the during, and after stages of termination. So in each, we're going to talk about what are the best practices that you should know. And I really think, I wish we could share this, presentation with everyone, because really there are going to be really good practical tips. So let's move on and get into it. And Jordan, when we first talked about this session, we really talked about what makes termination so hard. And we asked ourselves, what is it that makes it so hard, and why do we terminate? So why do we terminate? I think we can all come up with many examples of why, but really when we hone it into the why, we talked about, Jordan, poor performance, and I would group absenteeism, tardiness into the poor performance. You, Jordan, brought up a good point when we spoke about lack of cultural fit. That's an interesting one, right? Because you may have an individual, an employee who's an amazing performer, doing a great job in their actual work. But really, when you look at their attitude, it's not so great. Maybe the individual is not values aligned. Maybe they're spreading negativity, and they're causing more harm than good. So you may be considering terminating them because despite them being a good performer, their fit is not really there. A big one that is...
And Hen, can I just add one thing on there?
Absolutely.
When I was early in my career, I was working at Maple Leaf Foods, and one of the senior, and Maple Leaf Foods was very much a values-based company.
Yeah.
Everything from hiring to performance management, they were very, very big on the values, and it's something that always stuck with me. There was a senior leader at the business that was delivering results year over year over year, but really was a very nasty individual and alienated a lot of team members, was definitely not values aligned. And I remember thinking to myself, if this is a values-based company, how is this individual still here when they're
Absolutely.
getting results, but they're doing it at the expense of other people? And lo and behold, what happened is about 6 months later, the person was exited from the business. And my lesson learned there was, with senior people, it sometimes takes a little bit more time.
Yeah.
But ultimately, it does happen. And one of the things that you and I think would agree on is that if you do have that misfit or cultural lack of cultural fit, it's probably not going to change. Performance can change and improve, but if someone doesn't have a good attitude or doesn't fit into your culture, it's less likely to change in the future, I think.
I agree. It's typically related to their personality, just how they've always been. So it's hard to, it's not to say it's impossible, but it's hard to get them out of that. Jordan, one that we've been dealing with a lot since the pandemic is the downsizing, the restructure and downsizing that has gone up. Although I would say in the last year, I feel like it plateaued a little bit. It's not as common as it used to be in previous years. And the last reason that we came up with why we terminate is violations. So what do violations entail? It's the policy violations such as harassment. It could be health and safety violations. It could be dishonesty and fraud. It could be multiple things. And really in the violations piece, there is an obligation from employers to investigate. We do lots of investigations here at Max People at Rodney Employment Law. And it could be as a part of the investigation that the decision is to terminate the employee. So let's move on, Jordan, and talk about why it's so hard. I started off by saying, there are many reasons why it could be hard, but really let's talk about it. And I believe that it's hard because it's just hard. It's you're taking away someone's job. You're putting someone in a weaker position, and it doesn't feel pleasant. So in my opinion, I would classify this as the emotional impact. There's an emotional impact that you feel as a person, that, maybe you feel the empathy, maybe you feel the guilt. I truly believe that most people, not all, but most people don't want to do a bad job. So you have that element of, or that feeling of, they don't really want to do a bad job, and I'm taking away their job. There's also, I would say, Jordan, fear when it comes to terminations. I just had a termination. Unfortunately, I do participate in these termination meetings quite often. And a few weeks ago, we were terminating an employee that really had a horrible attitude. We knew it was time, but there was a lot of fear when it came to the actual meeting, especially with the manager that was sitting next to me. There was anxiety weeks before the actual meeting. It turned out that the meeting was just fine and it was uneventful, I would classify it. But that anxiety and fear of the actual meeting creates that emotional impact, right? There's also
similarly, Han, I had a similar situation with a legal client where the night before when we spoke with someone on our HR team, the owner gave me, and this is a company of about 150 people, about 10 reasons why the person had to be transitioned out.
Yeah.
And it's like, well, it's obviously very clear why you're doing this. And then the next morning he's like requesting a call. I think you were part of that termination as well. And he said, I'm having cold feet. And I'm like, why are you having cold feet? And thankfully, we quickly got him back on track. But it's that emotional connection to the individual. But it's not the right decision for the business. So we move forward, thankfully, with that one.
Yeah, absolutely. Jordan, I also wanted to say that, in terms of why terminations are hard, is that there is an impact to the team, right? Whether we like to admit it or not, there is impact when you terminate someone to potentially your culture, the team that's remaining at your organization, and you can't discount that. People develop friendships. I've been at Max People for almost 11 years now. I've developed some close friendships with people. You can't discount the friendships that have grown over the years and the impact that it has to those individuals that are remaining. And the last piece, Jordan, here that I wanted to mention is that there's also a legal impact. I mentioned this earlier, that terminations could be costly, and they could be very, very costly. I personally have a family member that I've been speaking to about terminating a 30-year service employee, and they just don't want to do it. And why they don't want to do it is because they know it's going to be costly. So there is that legal impact. I'm going to move on if you're okay with that, Jordan, unless you have anything else to say.
No, the only thing I would say is it's hard because we're not in the business of terminating people.
Yeah.
Like, companies are not in that business, and it's somewhat counterintuitive. So that's the main point I'd say here.
Agreed. So let's move on to the next slide, which is, we're going to get into right now the termination best practices. We're going to get into that before, during, and after, as I mentioned. And the one thing I want to say before I pass it over to you, Jordan, is that there is so much you can do to get the best possible outcome when it comes to termination. So, Jordan, I'm going to pass it over to you to start with the before.
Yeah, I think one of the things that I'd like to talk about, and this is like kind of the foundational pieces, is having a strong structure and strong foundation. And I've talked about this before in training sessions, but it's the three-legged stool. Yeah. The one leg represents having good employment agreements in place, or for independent contractors, independent contractor agreements. The second leg of the stool is your key company policies, like your compliance policies, and then there's the training. And if you have those three things in place, proper training, key company policies, and updated and enforceable employment agreements, it is going to bode quite well for a termination. It doesn't make the termination any easier, but it makes it a little bit less risky for the organization, because you can rely on the employment agreement as opposed to the common law. And I should point out that we're talking specifically in this session about non-unionized employees. Yeah. Obviously, unionized employees would be covered under a collective agreement. And there's some different nuances there, because obviously you can't terminate an employee in a union unless you have cause, which is different from the non-union environment. So with employment agreements, what I would say here, Han, and I know the HR team has heard myself and the lawyers talk about this, if you think about the toolbox, the toolkit that employers have, this would be the most valuable tool that an employer has, because if you have someone on an employment agreement, you can rely on that, and at the time of termination. The other thing I want to say about employment agreements is there's different kinds. There's an indefinite employment agreement where you're hired, indefinitely, subject to ending the relationship. There's also a fixed term agreement, which is with a specific start and end date. And one of the things that we say to clients is we only really want to use a fixed term agreement in very limited situations, because it can be problematic in terms of if you go beyond the end date. And cases have been very clear that if you put someone on a 3-year contract and you end the agreement after a year, unless you have really clear language, the company's on the hook for the remaining 2 years. So unless someone's on pregnancy leave or medical leave or really a short-term absence, we're not big proponents of fixed term agreements. The other thing I want to say is a lot of clients that we work with have what's called independent contractors. And with independent contractors, obviously you have to be truly an independent contractor, because if you terminate someone who is on paper an independent contractor, but in reality is either an employee or a dependent contractor with a D, then they're entitled to notice at common law. So it's something that you really want to look at. Of course, people love being contractors because there's benefits, they can write stuff off, but it might not make sense for your business. So let's go to the next question. I have a question here. Yeah. If you can just put a yes or no in the chat, just quickly, even a Y or N. Have you had your employments reviewed? And I'm not even going to say the last year, Hen. I'm going to say, have you had your employment agreements reviewed since January of 2024? And maybe if we can just have people
I see
type in the chat here.
Yeah, we recently just updated our employment agreements because of the Rodney Employment Law team making updates to our templates. There were recent case law that impacted very slightly, but our employment agreements. And we always like to, Jordan, make sure our agreements are up to date and always the best practice ones. I see a few no's, Jordan. I see one yes.
No. So for the people who've answered no, I highly recommend, and this is not a sales pitch, this is a money savings pitch.
Yeah.
That the best thing you can do is invest in having your employment agreements reviewed, because it literally can save you hundreds of thousands of dollars down the road. And if there's one investment you make, that this is the one I would say. I want to move on to the next slide. So there's kind of a combination of yes and no's here, and I recognize some of the names, so it's great to see everyone on the call today, and we look forward to your feedback post the session. So just a quick thing. I don't want to spend a lot of time on it. We could do a whole session on employment agreements, but here's the reality. The reality is, and I'll speak about Ontario, even though there's other provinces across Canada, obviously, that have similar developments, but I want to talk about Ontario. There was a case that came out about 4 years ago, Hen, that you're well aware of, that basically said that any violation of the Employment Standards Act means that the entire employment agreement is invalid when it comes to termination. Those cases have been extended, and a recent case from I think 2023 basically said that the employment agreement was fine, but the confidentiality clause that was part of like one of the company policies had language that violated the ESA. Thus, the agreement was invalid because of the the appendix confidentiality clause. So you really need to make sure your policies and your agreements kind of line up together. Yeah. Speaking of policies, I'm going to turn it over to you, Hen, to talk about how we can bring these to life.
Yeah, and I don't want to spend too much time on this, but I want to say that policies are there to provide guidelines to your staff, to your managers. But if you don't follow the policies, if you don't follow these guidelines that you create, then they really mean nothing. But that's not to say that, having policies, you can't make exceptions. So for example, Jordan, if an employee is at the hospital for a week and you only have a few personal days for them, you can make that exception to give them a few extra paid personal days to cover for their hospital stay, right? So you can make exceptions to policies, but really you want to bring them to life. Employment agreements you touched on a lot. An employment agreement is the most important document that you will share with an employee. So make sure that they're done right and that you follow them. And the last piece here is Jordan talked about a review of employment agreements that goes the same towards policies. You want to make sure your policies are reviewed at least annually. Your employment agreements are reviewed at least annually, if not sooner, as potentially there are legislative updates. That is to ensure that you're in compliance and to reduce your risks. Jordan, do you have anything to share here before we move on?
Yeah, the only thing I would say is with company policies, I'm often asked the question, like, do people need to sign off on the policies? The reality is the more you can get an acknowledgement, obviously the better.
Yeah.
But companies have a right to introduce policies from time to time. So for those that are on the line today, I'm really reluctant to include specific policies in an employment agreement, because if there's a conflict between your policies and the agreement prevails and trumps a company policy. So what you want to do in your employment agreement is you want to have the most broad clause possible that allows the company to introduce policies from time to time, because even in the last 5 years, there's been a tremendous influx of new policies. And if you try to introduce them and the employee says, oh, that's not in my employment agreement, you want to have language in there that says you can introduce new policies and the employees have to be bound by them. So that's the only other thing I would say. And, Hen, your team has done, I don't know, hundreds of policy handbook presentations.
Yeah.
And that's the best way to kind of socialize it with the group. So that's something I'd recommend.
Agreed. Good points, Jordan. So moving on, before we get into the actual during, we wanted this slide specifically because we talked about poor performance, underperformance as a reason for termination. And I'm sure most of you know that there are steps in progressive discipline. We recommend having a policy in place about progressive discipline. That's not to say that you can't skip steps when it makes sense. So for example, Jordan, if you have a probationary employee that you just don't have faith in them that they're going to actually perform, you can just cut to termination. You probably would be encouraged to do so. Or if there's a health and safety violation, you would potentially jump to a last chance agreement. But the reason why you want a policy in place is to show that, there's clarity. There is a policy in place, there's consistency, and, there's a fairness aspect because there's a policy. But again, not to say that you can't jump the steps when it makes sense. You reserve the right to do that. And Jordan, I'm going to pass it over to you to wrap up with some slides about with and without cause and some legal implications.
Yeah. So as I said, this isn't in the non-unionized setting, Hen, because in a unionized environment, it would be different. But from a non-union point of view, I'll talk about just cause first. This is when you terminate someone without notice or pay. Mm-hmm. And interestingly enough, what you don't want to do is you don't want to talk about performance issues in a termination letter or in a termination meeting and then give them a severance package. Mm-hmm. If you're either terminating for cause and you're not giving anything, or maybe mm-hmm. you're giving employment standards, which I'll talk about in a minute, mm-hmm. or you're going to give a severance package, but it's not the time. What you don't want to do is like give mixed messages to the employee of, oh, we got some performance issues, but we're terminating you without cause. Either mm-hmm. you have cause or you don't. And courts don't look favorably upon employers that do that. Now, they've complicated things in Ontario. There was a case that came out where a long service employee smacked a female employee on her buttocks in the cafeteria in front of other staff. A long service employee, the company investigated and they terminated this employee and they didn't pay him anything. Mm-hmm. Goes to the Court of Appeal, which is the highest court in Ontario. And what the court says is this employee was entitled to employment standards minimum entitlements of notice and severance pay. And yes, there was just cause under common law, like in the case law. Mm-hmm. However, the misconduct of slapping someone in a cafeteria in front of other employees didn't meet the Employment Standards Act test of willful misconduct or disobedience that has not been condoned by the company. So effectively in Ontario, there's two levels of cause. One is a higher threshold, and then one is common law. But for those that are on the line today, what you need to know is get legal advice when you want to terminate someone for cause. Without cause, which is the vast majority of non-union terminations, what you need to look at is either your employment agreement, as we talked about earlier, or if not, common law. And the factors you want to look at there for appropriate packages are age, service, level of job, compensation, and availability of similar employment. So the question, Hen, you want to ask, and we've had, I don't know how many conversations on this, is how likely is it and how long is it going to take this person to find a comparable job? And that's the appropriate severance package. And ultimately, my philosophy, which is not every employment lawyer's philosophy, is give them a little bit more, just enough that when they go to a lawyer, the lawyer is going to say, you got a decent package. Maybe it's not worth it, because you have to ask, how much is a release worth? Because you want our clients to get signed releases.
Yeah.
And so there's a bit of an art to doing that. And again, I would speak to your senior HR people or your employment lawyers on that point. So we'll move on to the next slide, Hen. And just wrapping up on legal implications. So, beware of things like, and Hen, you could probably talk about this, even more than me, things like don't terminate people, before their daughter's wedding. Don't terminate people who have told you they're pregnant, and then 2 weeks later, you've made the decision to terminate. Don't terminate someone who's gone on a leave of absence for severe clinical depression and bipolar disorder.
Yeah.
It doesn't mean you can't terminate, but you want to deal with these issues first. And when it comes to things like disability, Hen, what happens is the employee is trying to intermingle these issues, whereas employers are trying to keep them separate. So it's a challenge, and just beware there could be associated costs. And what I would say, Hen, before I turn it over to you, is consider the long-term implications of your decisions, and just know that you might have to delay a termination, not prevent a termination from happening.
Yeah. And just to wrap that up is, Jordan, my thought was also optics. You may want to terminate and go ahead with terminating someone that just came back from medical leave, but what message are you sending to your team when you do that, right? So just food for thought there. I want to be mindful of time as we are running close to the end of the session. So I want to talk quickly about the termination plan. And Jordan, I would say that the termination plan, in my biased opinion, is the most important piece to this whole process, because as we know, things could derail when it comes to terminating employees. The unexpected could happen, and you want to make sure you have a really good plan in place when it comes to the termination. So what do I mean by a plan? It's the timing and location. We are in a virtual world-ish. There is a lot of hybrid out there, but it may make sense to do a virtual termination versus an in-person termination, because your office is not conducive to having a private conversation. You want to think about the timing, either early in the day, around lunchtime, or late in the day. You want to make sure that there's the least amount of traffic if you're doing it in person. You also don't want to set up a meeting that's too far in advance. We just did one recently where we gave about an hour notice to the employee. We did a virtual termination, because you don't want the employee to worry for no reason, especially if it's a meeting that would probably come out of the blue. You want to also focus on, Jordan, who should be present. We always say 2 people, one to witness, right? You always want to have a witness. Usually HR and the managers sit in the meeting. You want to make sure that your termination documentation is proofread, triple checked. Make sure there are no errors, and that there's a script in place for the manager to follow. I always say this, Jordan, to the people that I sit in the terminations, is I don't care if it looks like you're reading the paper. I don't care if it sounds like you're reading the paper. I want you to say the script to a T, because I rather you read it and it sounds like you read it than you say something that is the wrong thing. Just a few weeks ago, Jordan, I had someone and the manager in the meeting say, "I'm sorry." And you and I both know that we should not apologize for a decision that we make. It is unfortunate, but you should not be sorry. So I gave him the feedback after.
Yeah, and I couldn't, what I always say to clients, Han, is, and this is like, even for like experienced business people that have done lots of terminations, preparation for termination and a meeting is not the time to practice your improv skills.
Exactly.
Not the time.
Exactly. And just 2 last points, Jordan, here is the systems access. You want to make sure that the systems are cut. You don't want the terminated employee to go into their email or Slack or Teams channels and start messaging other people. I've had once a situation, Jordan, where an employee was on a virtual meeting with us. We're terminating this person and their Teams call got dropped and they weren't able to get back on the Teams call and they were so upset. So I recommend, in virtual specifically situations, that you terminate access following the conversation and not during the conversation. And last but not least, you should always think about the communication to staff, whether you're going to meet as a team, whether you're going to have one-on-one conversations with your staff, specifically the remaining staff, to communicate the message of termination. So Jordan, I'm moving on to during the termination. And I said the termination plan is the most important part of the process, but I would say the termination is actually the hardest part in the process. It is the dreadful meeting that everyone doesn't want to have, that doesn't want to participate in, but unfortunately we have to, right? So let's talk about some tips and tricks. The first one being self-awareness. What I want you to take from here, and I am rushing a little bit, I apologize, Jordan. I just want to be mindful that we do have a few more slides here. But in terms of self-awareness, I want you to remember that this meeting is not about you as a participant in this meeting. It's about the terminated employee. So what you want to do is you want to remain calm, cool, and collected, the 3 C's. I always reference this. My team knows this. Despite things derailing, despite yelling, swearing, any of that happens, you want to remain cool, calm, and collected, or calm, cool, and collected, however you want to say it. You want to keep composed despite it going, south or sour. Now, the other thing, Jordan, I want to talk about is keeping the dignity and respect of the employee. And how do you do that? So we talked a little bit about, setting a time and place. It may make sense for you to have a virtual termination to avoid the public embarrassment, or if you have to have it in person, it may make sense for you to pack up their immediate belongings instead of them doing the walk of shame to their desk to collect their belongings. And then you could ship them the remaining items at a later time, right? You want to also think about, when it comes to dignity and respect, you want to be direct about the message. You are terminating their employment, but you want to be kind about it too. And how can you be kind? You could use a respectful, a calm tone. You see how, Jordan, I'm using a more calm tone, and it changes things when you use a calm tone versus a more direct and assertive tone. You want to avoid arguing. It's not a discussion. It's just to communicate a message and to go over package details. That's really the sole purpose of the termination. And the last but not least, and it's really important, Jordan, is that you want to watch their body language. And if they need more time, if you see that they're very emotional, give them a few minutes before you get into the details of the termination. I like to do that, and it's a really good tip. So we are running out of time, Jordan. So maybe we will go over a few minutes if you're okay with that, because I do think that we have some really good, valuable tips. So hopefully everyone is okay with an extra 5 minutes, but I am going to pass it shortly over to you, Jordan. In person versus remote. What I want you to know here is that we do this more than ever now since the pandemic. And what I want you to know here is that in terms of tips and tricks, I want you to keep your video on, despite the terminated employee removing their camera. That's okay. You want to make sure that you are on camera. I would also recommend that you send them the paperwork following the termination. And last but not least, what I quickly spoke about earlier is don't cut their access or any system's access until after the termination, to avoid any of those calls getting dropped and not being able to connect with them following that conversation. So Jordan, I'm going to pass it over to you to talk about after the termination.
Yeah, so I think the key points here, and those are some great points here, and especially the issue of self-awareness. I have literally seen every possible emotion in termination meetings over the years.
Yeah.
I've had phones thrown at me, One time I had to have an undercover, I had to do it in a Tim Hortons in London. I had an undercover security guard at the next table. You have to take these precautions where necessary.
Yeah.
But after the termination, after you're done, it's important to stay vigilant, because what you want to do is you want to close it off seamlessly, and you want to have minimal risk here. And ultimately you want to get a resolution to the issue. So some key things after the termination is communication. If we go to the next slide. So you want to have a single point of contact. You want to make it very, very easy for that individual to contact someone, name, phone number, email, hopefully someone they know, and make sure they have a point of contact. Better they speak to that point of contact than the Human Rights Tribunal, Ministry of Labor, or another lawyer. You want to do a check-in with the employee. I think, and this is something I actually learned from you, that it's important to just check in. Hey, how are you doing? Yeah. You're checking in. You're not their best friend, but you're checking in to see how they're doing. You don't want to conceal information. And you like it amazes me, Hen, when we typically represent companies, but sometimes we represent employees on the legal side through referrals and things like that. When they get in, when companies do not give them an extension. Hi, I've been on vacation. My lawyer's been away. Yeah. I need an extra week to respond. And the company's like, no, you can't get an extension. I don't understand that. I mean, it's just common courtesy. Don't delay information. Don't delay communication. And with communication, you want to focus on all the stakeholders. Executive team, you want to focus on the remaining staff. You want to focus on clients, suppliers. Communication is obviously key.
Yeah.
Next point I want to mention is damage control. And what you want to do post-determination is you want to be mindful of the surviving employees. You want to make sure, especially if there's multiple terminations, that you're very upfront with the remaining employees as to, like, we're done here, and onward and upward. Positive messaging, direct and positive messaging. You want to check in regularly with them. And here's the most important point. You want to quell rumors and gossip quickly. Yeah. You want to put it to bed. You can have a rumor board, and you can quell those rumors. Ongoing communication, do it in memos, do it in town halls, do it in huddles, but you don't want to have the rumors going.
And then, that being said, Jordan, I do want to point out that you can't also share too much information about the termination. So out of the respect and dignity towards the employees, so there is that balance that you have to make.
Yeah. And then the last thing I want to talk about is things like unsavory lawyers. No one at Rodney Employment Law would fit into that category. We are the savoriest lawyers you will ever meet. But there are a lot of unsavory lawyers, kind of like, you don't pay unless we win kind of lawyers out there. What you want to do is you definitely want to get advice. Look, if you want to try to negotiate with the employee, that's great.
Yeah.
But if lawyers are involved, just get the advice, because you got to figure out, do you want to lose the battle but win the war? How much is a couple of extra weeks worth? You have to factor in your time, getting a release, legal fees, all those factors. But get advice as soon as possible. And it doesn't necessarily mean that you need to get your lawyer involved. You can do this all behind the scenes. And thank you.
We always know, Jordan. We always know, Jordan, when an employee reaches out to us instead of hearing back from a lawyer is a good thing.
Absolutely.
Right? So
enough about lawyers. Let's wrap up. Let's wrap up with the do's and don'ts quickly, and then let's get to a couple of these questions.
So just quickly for the do's, Jordan, remember the purpose of the meeting, which is to communicate that message and go through the paperwork. Nothing else. You want to make sure you determine the right time and place. Make sure it's not on the person's birthday or a work anniversary or something, right before their kid's wedding. You want to make sure that's the right timing. Number 3, Jordan, is seek advice from experts. We can't say this enough. It may cost you a little bit, but really it will help you down the line with mitigating your risk from, that termination perspective, making sure that you're doing it right. Number 4, Jordan, is prepare and practice. I said that. I prefer people to read off the script versus going rogue and saying things that they shouldn't. And the last thing I'll mention here, because I do want to really wrap it up, is Anticipate the needs of the affected employee. So you mentioned communication with the employee, reaching out, make it easy for them. Don't make it harder for them. For the don'ts, don't have a lengthy termination meeting. Don't terminate someone with poor timing. It's really the opposite of what I just talked about. Don't react emotionally. That's a big one, right? Watch your emotion, have that self-awareness, and don't convey mixed messages to the employee. I briefly just want to mention that in my termination a few weeks ago, the employee that we terminated asked if there are future opportunities, can I apply and would I be considered? And we really just brushed it and said, we'll see, without giving her any hopes that would happen, because that's definitely not the message we want to send. So that being said, Jordan, I went through the don'ts so we could get into, first we have a QR code. So I just want to put this up here. It's a free resource for everyone. It's a termination checklist. And you also receive a complimentary 30-minute termination consultation. That's news to me, but I'm very happy to see that, because that's really
well, considering you're going to be one of the key people doing these complimentary consultations. Thank you for your service in doing that.
That's great to see. So I'm going to leave this slide on, but we do want to open it up to everyone to ask us some questions.
And I just want to say one thing, Hen, before we get to the questions. So the way that I think about terminations is because with practice, you can actually reach a very high level. Not that you want to be, an expert in terminations, but if you think of the Olympic athletes, they practice, prep, and then they get to their Olympic moment where they can shine. That's what you want to do in a termination meeting.
Yes.
And by doing some of the things that we talked about in the last 40 minutes. So let's get to the questions, and we'll turn it back to you, Christina. Maybe you could read them out here for us, and Hen and I will spend the next 5 minutes or so answering the questions.
Phenomenal. So we do have a question that came through, and I believe this is a great question. So what are your thoughts about explaining the reason for termination? What should you not say until they have signed the letter and release? They often ask why, and I feel it's fair they understand the reason, but we're often advised to say it's a business decision, even if there are performance issues, and not just eliminating the position.
I can jump in, Jordan, and then maybe you can take it from there.
Sure.
My thoughts is that terminations, especially when it comes to performance, shouldn't be a surprise. When we talk about performance management, you should be giving feedback to the employee, whether they're performing well or underperforming. So although you do say it's a business decision, ultimately my hope by that meeting is that they understand that, yes, it is a business decision, but yes, they also received a lot of feedback about their performance in the last 6 to 8 months. And it's just not a surprise. I've been a part of surprise termination meetings, but that's really the hope, that you want to give them the feedback, but you don't necessarily have to go into the details during the meeting. Because again, the decision is final. There's no negotiation. And you definitely don't want to have this meeting become I didn't do that. Yes, you did kind of rebuttal, right? So Jordan, if you have anything else to say, but that's
I don't think the commentary in a termination meeting provides any benefit for anyone. There's no reason to do it. If it's a cause termination and someone sexually assaulted another staff member or stole and sent client information to a competitor, you definitely want to talk about that, and you definitely want that to be in your letter.
Yeah.
If you are restructuring, you're eliminating a job, eliminating a department, downsizing, closing a plant, you definitely want to have that in your letter. But all other terminations, in my opinion, should be for business reasons. And, and I know that sucks for the employee, but there's just no advantage to getting into the editorial, in my view.
Agreed. And for those really bad situations that you mentioned, Jordan, typically they involve investigation. So harassment, someone stealing, stuff like that. There is an investigation that should happen. It's, again, the employer's responsibility to do so.
So I'll take this next question here. How can employers support terminated employees? So one of the biggest things I think that I was told probably in the first 2 to 3 years of my career by an outplacement guru who I still keep in touch with today was, you should always be offering, unless it's a cause termination, some kind of transition support for staff.
Yeah.
Not subject to a release, something to help the employee get back on their feet. You shouldn't make it conditional for a release. I've probably told literally 1,000 companies that over the last 25 years, but it actually makes sense because you want what's best for the employee. You want to help them, and it is in your interest as an employer for them to reemploy. So we actually have a great transition package that we offer our clients through our talent acquisition practice, but it's something that I would recommend that you offer unconditionally, not subject to any release. So I don't know kind of if you agree with that, don't agree, but
yeah, I may make it part of the release. Maybe we differ in that opinion, but I do think that transition, like outplacement services, are really good for the terminated employees. It gives them a way to, move on, an opportunity to really focus on their resume, coaching on how to have these interviews. Some people have been out of or employed for years and years, and they haven't practiced, how to interview. So it really comes in handy, in my opinion.
okay. There's another question here that asks, what are the biggest risks if a termination clause is invalid? This participant said they have a savings provision, which means that it's a clause in a contract that says even if one clause is invalid, like the termination clause, it doesn't mean all the other clauses are invalid. That's true on one end, but courts again have been very clear that once you violate the ESA, then your termination clause is basically unenforceable. So there's really not a way to save it. So it's not something that I would invest a lot of hope into. And again, just a reminder, please have your agreements reviewed. I'll let you look at this next question, Ken, this last question, then maybe we can wrap up.
Sure. I'm just reading here. My question is about terminations for women returning from maternity leave because the job was made redundant. The company delayed the communication of the termination by 6 months until the employee completed the EI 12 months, although employee, I may not have the full question. Christina, can you help me with that?
Yeah, of course. So the full question is, 6 months until the employee completed the EI, 12 months, although the employee wanted to return after 6 months of starting the maternity leave.
Yeah, I mean, termination during when someone is on a job protected leave is not ideal. We've been a part of situations where it happens, but I think this is a very nuanced question that would require us to talk a little bit more about the circumstances of why the job is redundant, and reach out to us and we can talk about this further.
But the only thing I want to add to that is if someone has 6 months left on their pregnancy leave or parental leave, and you're giving notice that, hey, your job's eliminated, that notice doesn't start until they're ready to come back to work.
Yeah.
Because you can't give someone notice when they're on leave, because the thinking is they're not able to look for a job. So you could give them a courtesy, hey, we're letting you know your job's going to be eliminated, but it doesn't count as the legal notice. That's an important nuance there.
Yeah. And the one final thing I'll say is that there is an obligation to offer a similar job. So you really have to look at, okay, the job doesn't exist, but is there something similarly that exists? That's why it's a more complex question. Happy to help if you reach out.
So I think we're going to wrap.
Do you have any more questions? Or
one last question here, which we'll take. What are some examples of a transition package? Maybe Shannon, you can be a little bit more specific there. I'm not sure of your question. Obviously, if you're asking, you can pay a package via lump sum. You can pay a package via salary continuance. You can pay a package by working notice, or a combination of all three. if that's your question, but that's probably the easiest way to answer that, unless you had more specifics that you wanted to ask.
Yeah.
And I'll let you close off here, Christina and Chen.
Yes, Christina.
All right. Thank you all for providing those amazing questions today. And we really hope you found this presentation very informative. And thank you to our community for joining us and asking these amazing questions. We really appreciate your participation. As a reminder, a recording of the session and a feedback survey will be made available, and feel free to scan the QR code that is available on the screen right now. And please take a moment to answer these questions, as we genuinely appreciate your opinion. If you would like more information on the topics we have discussed today, you can check out our resources and blogs page on our website, or reach out to the team at Max People and Rodney Employment Law. Please keep an eye out for an invitation to our upcoming virtual events, and also stay connected with us and follow our LinkedIn page to stay up to date on all things HR and employment law. Thank you all so much for joining us today, and we hope you have a wonderful rest